So, why don't you maybe, since you guys haven't met, why don't you maybe introduce yourself and some of the work that you're doing with mythical thinking and poetry and
Okay.
yeah.
Well, my name's Mike. Um, it's really good to meet you, Greg.
Likewise.
Um, you want me to talk about the work that I'm doing?
Well, I've just always wanted you guys to talk. Greg's written several books on language theory, and Greg and I have a lot of good talks. But you actually do more work with language than I do, and I'm really
Y-
excited to hear more about your PhD thesis because I've seen little excerpts, but I know you've been working hard on it, and from what I've seen, it's great. So I was just hoping you maybe give a summary of maybe your PhD
Oh, yeah.
dissertation.
Working on a PhD. Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about that if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. I specialize in poetics. It's called, just theories of poetry. Um, but my concentration is in the 20th century. But of course, I like to jump around a lot chronologically. My project is about certain 20th century writers who are trying to understand why poetry is not as effective as it supposedly used to be. Um, and so I kind of trace the history of this attitude and where it came from. In the 17th century, um, experimental science started to take off. And when that happened, there was this sort of self-conscious attempt to distance the language of science from the language of poetry.
Mm.
And I'm interested in sort of tracing that tendency of thought for the next several centuries. Um, I'm looking very specifically at one manifesto written by Virginia Woolf, who is, of course, a novelist. And in this manifesto, which people don't talk about that much, she was preparing to write her most experimental book, and which is The Waves. And
Mm.
The Waves is very poetic. Like people just find it to be very difficult. It's different from her other books, and people who really love Woolf sometimes just are like, I don't really like that book. So in the manifesto, which she wrote several years before really starting to write the book, she basically plots out what she's going to do. And her idea is that she's going to combine prose of the novel with poetry. And so she has this implicit theory of the poetry that I try to tease out of her argument. She makes a lot of statements that aren't really she implies a lot without really giving evidence for her arguments. So I really read her argument closely and I try to understand where her ideas are coming from. And I try to find where there are certain contradictions, where she stops making sense and why she stops making sense and what that says about poetry itself,
Mm.
about why it's so difficult to theorize about poetry. People have consistently failed to define it. Um, for several
Poetry.
centuries, people just been able to define poetry.
Mhm.
And so my dissertation looks very closely at all the ways in which people try to define poetry and cannot do it. And ultimately, I conclude and make a big argument for why poetry is a sort of mythical thought in language. I use this concept of mythical thinking, which I take from Ernst Cassirer. He's a philosopher who is sort of like Heidegger's rival. And they have this famous debate. Um, in many ways, they're quite similar. Anyway, did you have something to say, Greg?
Oh, no, no, I'm just kind of nodding that I understand what you're saying and sounds really interesting. I like it. So
Yeah.
you're doing a bit of a critique of Virginia Woolf, but also in the process doing a kind of a deep dive into poetry and why it is the case that we seem to be, I think you were saying we seem to be moving away from the popularity of poetry. Am I getting the gist right there?
Yeah, that's right. So the question is poetry, what do we mean when we say poetry? But when we ask the question, is poetry somewhat sidelined? Has it been marginalized by other discourses, namely, scientism? Is that really true? And that's a problem that Heidegger takes on. And of course, he's like, poetry's amazing. Like we need to be more poetic as thinkers. And science is like doing the opposite of that. But I use Cassirer, who's also interested in the question, and he doesn't really take sides as much. He believes that the language of science, language of philosophy, which he calls theory, is good. Like that sort of language taken to it's the fullest expression of our language potentialities. And poetry is, everything that we do in language kind of grows out of poetry. So poetry, in a sense, is like, quote unquote primitive. But at the same time, it's not. He's not saying primitive in a negative sense whatsoever. And I obviously really like poetry. So Cassirer feels that poetry is its own like domain. And Adam is interested in talking to me because he doesn't it seems that you don't see as much of a distinction between poetry and philosophy as I do. And I would, in many cases, poetry and philosophy have a lot in common. And Virginia Woolf, in this piece that I'm looking at, it's called Poetry, Fiction, and the Future. She seems to be someone who really believes that poetry and philosophy have a lot in common, but she doesn't substantiate the claim. And so I'm like, what does she mean by that exactly? What she does tell us is that poetry is similar to philosophy because they're both concerned with very fundamental concerns. I mean, questions. They both have these concerns to do with death, like where we're going, stuff like that kind of Heideggerian stuff. And poetry does do that. It takes it adopts this aerial view on life, and it can, from on high, just really kind of abbreviate the world. And think about these big questions. On the other hand, poetry ends up doing the opposite of philosophy, and it comes all the way down from the clouds or from space, and it like inhabits the world of ants and bugs and so forth. And in that sense, poetry is more like a child. It's interested in particularities rather than the general. And then on the other hand, poetry is sometimes the lover, which is kind of like the child. And it's very poetry, and this is probably where this is most people's association with poetry. Most people would assume if you tried to tell most people poetry and philosophy are similar, they'd be like, huh? I think it's more because they're imagining poetry as the lover, expressing strong, intimate feeling and emotion, that kind of thing. Romantic language, sort of the language of intimacy, in other words. And that seems to have very little to do with the conceptual language of philosophy. So, like, what are we talking about when we talk about poetry? Ultimately, my view is that poetry can do it has these three different modes, and all of them are a form of mythical thinking. But nevertheless, poetry and philosophy have very similar concerns. Both of them are very interested in understanding the world as it is and perhaps presenting something more desirable. And so that's what I think that all forms of like what Hegel would call absolute spirit do. Absolute spirit, like philosophy and religion and art, all concerned, in my view, with sort of understanding what is and maybe like creating something better. So all of them sort of come out of a dissatisfaction with life, right? But the means by which they understand what is or create something better are very different. Philosophy uses the language of concepts. It interrogates concepts, and it creates new concepts to interrogate concepts. So it's just it's a meta conceptual language, very similar to science, but science is interested in understanding like nature, understanding the natural world and the universe, and testing its hypotheses, which is a kind of physical process. Whereas the way in which philosophy verifies its ideas and hypotheses is just through reason alone. It doesn't have to have the testing doesn't have to have a physical basis or empirical basis. So they're similar in that way, but I also understand that philosophy is not always just conceptual language. In many cultures, or I should say, before Plato, philosophy was less systematized, less systematically rational. And in many cultures, philosophy is a lot closer to poetry. So I'm mainly concerned with philosophy in this very Western sense of the word, where philosophy is the interrogation of concepts. It's almost the interrogation of culture in the broadest sense, but really the interrogation of the concepts that we use. For instance, Plato thinking about justice. What is justice? Do we really know what justice is? And he has to create a conceptual framework to even go about this interrogation, this inquiry. And so concepts are always being updated and revised and changed, and philosophy becomes a sort of self-enclosed discourse where concepts refer to other concepts used by different philosophers, and there aren't really stable meanings and so forth. And that's why people are so alienated by philosophy. They feel like they have to learn a new language to do it. It's not just regular language, it's like language on steroids.
Yeah.
And then poetry is like, I would say, very different than that. Despite similar concerns sometimes, poetry is like using language and blending it with myth. And that's precisely what Plato wanted to get away from. Plato was like, we shouldn't be teaching our kids what's right based on myth. Because that's not using reason. We should be using philosophy instead. My kind of philosophy, he would say. And so I see there as being a kind of spectrum where there's language as most people use it, and then towards science and philosophy, you have you try to get away from metaphor as much as possible, because when you start going in the direction of metaphor on this end, that's where you start going towards myth, and that's where language starts blending with mythical thinking. Science tries to get away from it, which of course is probably impossible, because all the words we use have this mythical baggage, this residue, and you can't get rid of it. It's always going to be there in the DNA. But science tries to limit the amount, the extent to which metaphor can interfere with rational interrogation of the world. It tries to, it probably knows that it can't. You could create a brand new language where all the signs are, completely arbitrary and not connected to, hunting or the seasons and stuff like that. You could do that, but we're not going to do that.
We do have a friend that's kind of trying to do that, but
yeah, like mathematics tries to kind of do this.
Yeah, he's got us.
Yeah, formal languages. Yeah.
So that's basically, I feel like I've talked a lot. That's basically my project. At least that's the theoretical side of my project. It's interesting to see all the these various intellectuals throughout history weighing in on poetry, and they sometimes some of them really like hate poetry. Some of them are like, no, poetry can be more like prose. Prose is usually the language of science. And people are trying to find this kind of compromise, but it just never really occurs.
Mm.
And now we're at the point where, science doesn't really have to defend itself. And poetry is, it's its own sort of subculture, I would call it. It's not going to go away, and people still write poetry. But no one really knows what they're doing when they talk about it. And it's pretty much been decided that poetry can be anything, kind of like art.
Mm.
And I don't know if it's good to not have any kind of understanding of what poetry is. Like, people act like they know what it is, and people consistently act the same ways towards poetry. And that's because we do share a lot in common in terms of what we're perceiving when we've all been exposed to poetry, and we've made similar connections, and we tend to just know if something's a poem or not always. And I'm really interested in that.
Mm.
I'm interested, for instance, in looking at like two texts. Let's say you don't even know who wrote the text. One of them has line breaks and meter and everything, but it's just like going to the hardware store. It's just like explaining a trip to the hardware store where you're buying things for the renovation of your house. But it has all this the text will have rhyme and meter and all this stuff associated with poetry. And then the other text won't have rhyme or meter or anything like that, but it's heavily mythical in terms of its content. And people are likely to people are likely to identify that text without any of the secondary characteristics, without meter or rhyme. Because of mythical language, they'll be like, that's poetry.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so the rhyme and meter stuff also contributes to identifying something as poetry. All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Do you see poetry as kind of like more similar to ordinary everyday language, as opposed to a specialized kind of language like you find in a lot of philosophy?
This is a great question. So the everyday language, yeah, I use that term myself. Poetry tends to differ from everyday language, but sometimes actually a lot of poetry is written in what we would call everyday language. So what gives? Like when you read Rilke, it's much more emotionally and spiritually lofty, and then there are all these like allusions to literary things, and then myths and the moon and trees and nature and stuff like that. So that's more like mythical language. But then you have a poet who's less lofty than Rilke, and there are many such poets. So they're not using this heavily mythological language. The way I see it is, a lot of poetry doesn't have to do that, but it has to compensate in other ways for it to be poetry. So I think that there are primary characteristics, I have like three primary characteristics, which are all mythical. There's like using a lot of metaphor, simile and stuff like that. There's also using like the language of cycles and nature and stuff like that, dreamlike images and so forth, potent images. That's also, heavily mythical stuff. Using apostrophe, like where you're apostrophizing something that can't really respond. Like, oh, moon. That's a kind of mythical gesture right there. And so those characteristics are dominant. It's hard to define something. It's hard to identify something as a poem if it doesn't have like at least one primary characteristic. And then it would need like at least one secondary characteristic, which would be like line breaks or other kind of rhetorical devices. And there are many, many different secondary characteristics.
Kind of reminds me of a humorous definition I heard one time of somebody, it was a judge who was asked to judge whether or not something was pornography.
Yeah.
And
you just know it when you see it.
Says, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah, because I'm aroused. No.
Yeah. So poetry is kind of similar in a way. It's like I can't define it, but I kind of know it when I see it.
Exactly.
Or feel it.
Exactly.
One of
So
those.
most people agree what pornography is, but some people don't. Um, and so why,
Mhm.
the question of why people sometimes can't agree about what they usually agree on is interesting to me.
Mm.
And that non-agreement leads you to something interesting, towards being able to
Right.
philosophically understand the category better.
Wittgenstein would have, well, what he says about words, especially like a word like game. He talks about game. We call all kinds of different things games, and we can't find any one thing or two things that they all have in common,
Yeah,
but they form a kind of family resemblance.
yeah,
The different kinds of games, they overlap, kind of like the way the traits of different members of a family overlap. Nobody has one of all the same traits, but yeah, it's loose in that way. Poetry is, and so I think that's one reason why it's really hard to pin down what exactly counts as poetry.
exactly.
Same with art.
Yes, yes, and I'm very interested in that question as well. Yeah, but then what you just brought up with Wittgenstein, yeah, that is the predicament that I found myself in. There are all these
Mm.
different traits loosely connected, but it is like a family resemblance rather than there being an essence.
Right.
But so as a concept, poetry is pretty incoherent. So in a practical sense, though, I take it this genealogical tack, where like I just assume that it's an incoherent concept, and so I say, well, I think when people talk about poetry, they're actually talking about lyric poetry. Right? They're not talking about Homer and tragedies. They're not talking about epics. They're not. They're usually not talking about ballads and like folk poetry. They're usually talking about lyric poetry.
Mm.
Is lyric really based in music? I say no. I say that what we call lyric poetry, like these short poems that are usually personal, but sometimes not personal. I think they started out being impersonal. I think that they all can be traced back, that everything we call lyric can be traced back to hymns, ancient hymns. Like
Mm.
the oldest literature we have is from Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Mm.
And the hymns are very similar. All the oldest hymns are very similar no matter where you are in the Near East. And in other traditions too, the early hymns are very similar. And it's usually someone propitiating a deity, um, hoping to get something from the deity,
Mm.
or give thanks to the deity, or celebrate the deity or some ruler. And the poet doesn't really insert themselves into the text as much as what we've come to do with lyric. But this is the starting point.
Mm.
Speaker propitiating something out there. The text is usually pretty short, relatively, and it's based on the assumption that language um, can affect the world. It's almost based on the same assumption that people sort of have when they're watching sports. They're like watching the Super Bowl and it's their team, or they have a lot of money on one of the teams, and it's come down to the wire, and it's like a field goal kick. People are like praying and stuff like that.
Mm.
So think about ancient people. Long time ago, you needed the crops to grow, or you'd be hunting, or so forth. You need to be protected. So people were always kind of, um, they were always propitiating in the form of like hymns.
Mhm.
And I think that these like short poems that are propitiations, where you're almost like persuading a god to do something, very similar to love poetry, by the way, where you're trying to convince someone to be in love with you or sleep with you,
Oh, right.
or you're trying to make someone in love with you, like a spell.
Mm.
Um, it's the same idea. You're using language to cast a spell,
Yeah.
and that's what hymns are. and that's where lyric comes from. And it's just the lyric form, what we consider lyric has transformed over time. It's become pretty different. It's a lot more personal than it used to be, but it ultimately goes back to hymn. And hymns rely on this sort of faith in sympathetic magic.
Hmm.
Being able to like use your mind or using language to to influence the world, the physical world.
Hmm. I read
And
somewhere too
yeah,
where somebody was speculating on what was the origin of meters and rhyming and all that. They were saying that in addition to, let's say, what you're saying about hymns, the reason that hymns were constructed in a certain way, like with meter and rhyme, was for the purpose of helping memory, so that it's like a tool for memory, where it's especially beginning with oral cultures where they didn't have anything written. They had to rely upon remembering these songs and hymns, and it's a lot easier to remember things if they have a rhyme, because then the rhyme kind of jogs your memory about what the next line is or the next few lines or whatever,
yeah,
as well as the meter, because you can expect a certain pacing, a certain length of the line and whatnot.
it definitely does. It definitely does help with memory. That's for sure. At the same time, I mean, it's not only rhyme that does that, and it's not only meter that can help with memory. Because a lot of really ancient poetry didn't have rhyme. I mean,
Mm,
rhyme was not very common.
mm.
Much
Like
more
when you
common.
say ancient poetry, going back to say approximately when?
Well,
Uh, Greek.
The Greeks barely used rhyme. Right.
Okay.
And
Did they use meter in the?
yeah, they used meter, of course. But in in Akkadian, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or something, it was really parallelism that was being used the most.
Mm,
That was the most consistent secondary device that was being used. And you have a lot of that also in the Bible or the Old Testament, in those scriptures. So, I mean, there are different things that help with memory. And like, why does it help with memory? It just makes stuff more compelling. Um, and so I don't think that memory was the only reason people would employ these devices. Like if you're trying to seduce somebody, um, you just want it to sound good. You want to hypnotize them.
mm,
And so one of the byproducts of hypnotizing someone is like you're gonna create something memorable. You're infiltrating their mind essentially. I do understand that like if you're hypnotized, you might not remember being hypnotized, but so like it's like a dual function. You're helping memory by like creating something that's making an emotional impact.
mm-hmm,
If you make an emotional impact on someone, they're more likely to remember what happened.
mm.
Or
So,
or else you could traumatize them and they won't remember anything. But um
And also, if you're trying to influence nature, it's that rhythm and rhyme and all these dimensions of mythical and poetic thinking. There's some sense, especially if you have a metaphysics that says that the world is made of harmonies, that there's a music of the spheres, and there's this correspondence between everything, then you want there to be correspondences in your language that can resonate.
Exactly. So rhyme and meter are just another form of metaphor. Metaphor is just like this is kind of like that, and then rhyme and meter like that sound is like that. Um,
you
metaphor
know,
is rhythmic.
do you
Sorry.
know historically when approximately rhyming became like a popular way of doing poetry? Or
Well, in English, it becomes way more popular by Chaucer's time. But Beowulf was not rhyming, and Old English
Mhm.
stuff wasn't rhyming. Um, there used to be they don't know exactly, but in English they used to say it was because of the Arabs, that it was imported um, from the Arabs, because the Arabs were all over Europe at that point and they were using rhyme. But it's not as simple as that, it turns out. But to answer your question in a very general way, Rhyme has always existed, but in many different poetries, rhyme has not served a central role.
Hmm.
And just all over the world, rhyme is not
Okay.
tends to not be central in traditional poetry. In some, yes, but in others, no.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, I wasn't really aware of that. I thought, mostly a lot of modern poetry would be a non-rhyming. Um, and I thought the further back you would go, you would find more rhyming, more of
No,
an
no,
adherence.
no. But you always find something like meter and strong rhythm and chanting. That's universal.
Okay.
The rhyme is not really, it's universal, but it's as a central element of poetry, it's not universal.
Hmm. Hmm.
Metaphor is very universal.
Yes, that raises another question. I I don't know if Adam, do you want to interject something before I throw in this question or?
No, I mean that was kind of where I would want to go. Is I'd want to get your take on metaphor, because that's something Mike and I were just recently discussing, and from you I've gotten some ideas about the fundamental metaphoricity of not only language but the universe, from your take on Derrida and the kind of would you say even
Mhm.
the metaphysics of metaphoricity?
Mhm. Well, I was just thinking today about Derrida's essay in Margins of Philosophy called White Mythology, which, as it turns out, is an essay about metaphor, but it's entitled White Mythology. And apparently the way, I mean, it's a really difficult essay. It's like 3 or 4 sections. It's almost like a book in itself. But it basically he's the way in which mythology comes into it is that he's saying that, well, white mythology is basically Western philosophy. That Western philosophy is something that functions like kind of like a myth, has a mythic dominance, in the psyche of the Western mind, um, especially with the way in which it deals with oppositions and the way in which it, has latched onto so much idealism and the importance of ideals and which of course relates to concepts and the role of concepts and reasoning, um, and the emphasis on that as Mike was saying. And so he takes that as kind of an opening, establishing that, and then works into metaphor. And it's interesting now, he gets this from Heidegger, apparently, where someplace Heidegger says that something along the lines that if outside of um, metaphysics, well, actually, let me see if I can find the exact passage because I did try to mark it. It was in because it would be good to get it to you in a footnote. Here it is. The metaphysical exists only within the borders of, I'm sorry, the metaphorical exists only within the borders of metaphysics. So chew on that one. The metaphorical exists only within the borders of metaphysics.
Yeah, but which metaphysics? It wouldn't necessarily be Western metaphysics. Like metaphor tends to be, yeah, I agree, it's totally metaphysical. But so what does Derrida have in mind? He, of course, wouldn't be connecting it to Western metaphysics, right?
Metaphor?
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. Basically, Derrida is saying in White Mythology that that there is no escape from metaphor,
right.
not even in science, not in philosophy, of course, not in poetry. There's no place you can go, although philosophy, according to Derrida, has pretended or tried to make the claim that it is that there is some kind of a core which is non-metaphorical.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where the metaphysics of presence would come in, where we're talking about what is and the here and now and that type of thing. And that's supposed to be free of metaphor. And so metaphor, Derrida is arguing is, from Plato especially forward, is even though Plato has things to say about poetry and the distinction between poetry and philosophy and metaphor and reason, Plato makes extensive use of metaphor.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. So he's saying that no matter how much you try to get away from metaphor, it's always there, and metaphysics tries to escape it, but it's
Yes,
delusional.
and in one further part of the essay, he's saying that even metaphor itself cannot grasp metaphor. There is no metaphor to understand metaphor. It produces a situation where there's definitely a use of the word metaphor that lies outside of any metaphorical access, and yet that's a conundrum because, like he's saying, you can't escape metaphor. And so it's kind of like one of those paradoxes, like the liar paradox or something, where you're trapped in this circle where you can't really get outside of it. And of course, Derrida says the same thing about metaphysics. He says there is no escape from metaphysics, and that ties in to what he's saying about metaphor as well, when he claims that metaphysics is metaphorical. There's no escape from either one of them because there's nothing outside the text. Basically, his famous line of grammatology: there's nothing outside the text. There is no outside. There's only an inside and a circling of the inside back upon itself. So I wonder, okay, having said all of that, what your thoughts might be about that in connection with what you're doing. You seem to kind of agree with some of that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But maybe I wouldn't say that it's impossible to understand metaphor. Um, like I wouldn't try to find a metaphor to understand metaphor, but I would try to describe what's going on when people are making metaphors using something like conceptual language, knowing full well that I can't escape metaphor. um, I mean, for me, like I ground metaphor in myth, not like ancient myths, but this concept of myth. I think it's one of our faculties of thought, and it's separate from language. And yeah, it is. I can't quite understand it, but it is a sort of mode that we lapse into in certain situations, even as fully secular people. I mean, like in this very secular world where religion and magic don't seem to have much weight. Nevertheless, the most rational person lapses into a mythical mindset sometimes, like at a funeral,
Mm,
where they think they can like connect with the spirit of the deceased and so forth, and that they're
mm,
like, I hope he's in a better place now, and they're like sincerely saying this, not just as a platitude, but that's just it's a mode, and I connect it to emotion. I would never claim to fully understand this mode, but I know that it's very different from what we call rational thinking.
mm, mhm,
And it's a way of thinking that is very concerned with resemblances. Like concepts are very interested in language, and concepts are very interested in distinctions. But
mhm,
but it seems like myth is very interested in finding resemblances, and not necessarily interested in representing reality as a totality, but interested in these sort of like vivid moments that kind of annihilate the rest of reality.
Mhm.
And with, trauma and psychosis, mythical thinking takes over like crazy. And it makes it hard to reason with people. But I would say that mythical thinking isn't always dangerous. Um, and it can actually be really good. And it can even help with scientific and conceptual thought. Anyway, I don't want to get too far afield from the question. So
Mhm.
I feel like I have a handle on where metaphor is coming from. It's coming from this more general impulse, um, this mythical impulse that generates metaphors, and also kind of implicitly believes in sympathetic magic
Mm.
and sympathetic sort of connections between all things, this kinship of all things. It's a
So
weird mindset. I don't understand it though.
in saying that, though, would you still, and I would agree with you that there's a close connection between myth and metaphor, but would you still maintain a distinction? Like maybe we could say that myth is more like an allegory and metaphor is more like an analogy, something like that.
Metaphor is very close to analogy, and they're both forms of mythical thinking. So allegory is also similar to those, but it tends to sort of put way more emphasis on identification. Um, like there's a kind of like lack of ambiguity that you have with allegory. There's like a right way of interpreting an allegorical painting. No, the rose means this, and this means that.
Mm,
Whereas with metaphor in a much more um, polysemous sense, there's a lot more ambivalence and ambiguity. There's no right answer necessarily.
mm,
Say either it feels apt or it isn't. It's not a question of what is. It's just a question of does that feel correct, or
mm.
does that seem plausible? Um, and so there's a kind of openness to metaphorical text, whereas allegory is like metaphor in some ways, but it lacks that openness. It has a closedness.
So myth would be more open to various interpretations.
Yeah. And so allegory apparently, I think it was Octavio Paz and someone else who were saying that allegory kind of comes about when you have these sort of people who are trained in Neoplatonism, who are trying to make sense, like in the Alexandrian Hellenistic period.
Mm,
These scholars were trying to actually show that ancient myths um, did have like a rational argument behind them.
mm.
And that's where you first start finding allegory. Um,
Okay.
so it was an attempt of rational thinkers, systematically rational people trying to understand myth.
Huh. That's an interesting. That's interesting. I'll have to make a note of that. That's good. Um, so,
So allegory is somewhere in between myth and rational thought.
okay. Now, I don't know if we're ready to make this jump, but suppose we do we want to talk a little bit about the possible presence of myth in our current culture? You know, what constitutes myth today? Is it like found in our films or in our TV shows or
I definitely want to get your take on that because you and I have had a lot of discussions back in the day in written form about myth. I don't think we've talked about it recently, but yeah, I think your analysis of film and your books on film didn't always talk about myth, and so I was always trying to bring up myth to you. Um, and I think there
hmm,
might be that was part of our disagreement or or talking past each other was I think people often do associate myth with allegory, and I would maybe associate that with the problems of modernity in general, which are of representation. So, and same with my difference with Mike sometimes is the way he describes philosophy or science. For me, I think those same problems that exist in philosophy and science also exist in art, and they all have to do with the modern mind's kind of loss of this kind of open system thinking and kind of being mesmerized by representation. So even if they're just trying to paint something that this is what it means, so it's an allegory in some sense, or in philosophy, it's just a discrete connotation. And so I really draw a lot from Deleuze's distinction between this. He doesn't like this distinction between the abstract and the concrete. For him, what opposes the abstract is not the concrete, but the discrete. And so for him, the abstract and the concrete are both the same thing. Like the more abstract you get, the more concrete you get, because you're actually getting more into the relations between everything. It's the discrete form that actually is, in some sense, the illusion that both science, philosophy, and art can all fall into. I think so. I like to make more of the distinction. I mean, I find everything Mike's saying fascinating. I have really nothing to disagree with, and he's has a specific focus. But I'm just more interested in the distinction between good and bad anything, good and bad art, good and bad science, good and bad philosophy.
As I was trying to tell you, when like you didn't like me saying that for Cassirer, philosophy abbreviates reality, or theoretical thinking abbreviates and art intensifies. And I'm like, I thought about that. That is kind of insulting, actually. But the way I see it is very similar to Deleuze. The more abstract you get, like the more abstract philosophy gets, the more it can actually correctly represent or like understand some reality. And in that way, it is intensifying. But the means are abstract means. And so it is about first abbreviating towards intensification.
A lot of philosophy is, but then I really like mystical occult philosophy, and that's more concrete. And so for me, I'm always kind of juggling more ancient symbolic occult theory and also academic theory, which tends obviously to be more abstract. But I mean, it all like coming out of Derrida and Deleuze and these postmodernists, I think we're reacting against that tendency of representation. And so I mean, if you read Derrida, especially Derrida, I think was very poetic. Heidegger loved poets, but I think Derrida was more of actually a poet, like the way that he used language. And so, I don't think the abstract and the concrete are really opposed. And I think that but this idea that philosophy or science abbreviates reality, I think that's the illusion that analytic philosophy and certain continental philosophers, especially back in the day, thought that that's what they were doing. They thought that they were, but everything basically is a selection. So there's nothing that isn't both abbreviating reality and intensifying some quality or another. And so for me, I can't say this is more intense than anything else, but I can say this is more intensely related to this thing. And so for me, the good art or good science and good philosophy are what actually make the right kinds of intensive relations. Like they increase intensity in the ways that we want. And I think what gets in the way of that is believing that we can somehow abbreviate reality in a non-selective sense, and I think that's the myth of a lot of Western thinking, because it's, it is trying to get at the truth. But once you get into like relational thought, then the abstract and the concrete aren't opposed. Then it's, abstraction is just it's a metaphor. It's a trope. It's a turning of one thing, using one thing and connecting it to something else. And so that's all thinking is that relational movement of one thing in one register into another. And so doing that and violating these discrete boundaries between not only fields and modes, but ways of thinking is actually what makes good art, good science, and good philosophy.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say that a lot of poetry isn't very concrete or particular at all? It's quite abstract, right?
Exactly.
Right. So that for me is obvious. I mean, poems can alienate people because they're so very abstract, and metaphors themselves act like concepts in some ways. There is a lot of abstraction there. And so I too don't believe in this easy binary between the particular and the general.
Derrida says something that would support what you're saying here in White Mythology, when he asks the question, what would be the difference between a good and a bad metaphor? And he starts probing that by saying, well, it's paradoxical because the more you start trying to explain why a metaphor is good, the more you are actually tending to reduce its abstraction. You are narrowing it down and saying, well, it matches, so many points. It's similar in so many ways to this that it makes a good metaphor to the extent that, well, if it were a perfect metaphor, it wouldn't be a metaphor at all. It would be more like a copy or something. So
Yeah, the best metaphor is actually like if I answer that without acting like Derrida, I would say what most people feel. The best metaphors are when you take something that's like the more radically different it is in some ways, makes for the most apt metaphor. It's that tension between not appropriate at all and very apt.
yeah,
Like
which seems really odd, but when you think about it and when you experience it, the difference between experiencing it and thinking about it is interesting. Yeah, because of the way it speaks to you. And yet, yeah, if you look at it closely, you say, well, those things don't belong together at all. But bringing them together, really like sometimes gives you a blinding insight. It's like really amazing.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Adam, that seems to speak to what you were saying here about Deleuze. Between the concrete and the abstract are kind of similar in that the the considering metaphor as an abstraction, um, the less abstract it is, then the less metaphorical it becomes. But since we can't get away from metaphor, we are basically in one version or another of the abstract or the concrete. And it's kind of a puzzle to decide where exactly it is. Is that
I call it a concept image, by the way. You've seen me write about that, right? It's like metaphors are abstract, but also very sensuous at the same time.
And that's the kind of philosophy I like too. I mean,
Yeah.
I tend to write like that too, which makes it I know frustrating for people. I know Greg just mentioned that I don't have many examples and reasons often when I write, and it's often because like my favorite book up there, Savitri, is it's 900 pages of image after image after image, and it's all concepts, but it's all like using imagery to explore spiritual concepts. And I'm not trying to be explicitly poetic, but I am influenced by that kind of writing. I really like this guy William Irwin Thompson who tried to write like that too. He was influenced by Aurobindo, and he called because Wissenschaft is knowledge craft, like I think, right, in German, which is like technology. And so he's like, well, Kunst would be knowledge art. And so like imbuing art with knowledge is what I'm interested in. Deleuze wanted to separate them. He liked them when art was just
I'm more like Deleuze in this sense. But what's that Jim Morrison quote from one of his poems? You quote it often, and it's very occult. You had it memorized before.
That doesn't narrow it down.
Okay, well, anyway.
I got a lot of Morrison stuff in my head.
But you interpreted this very cryptic thing in a very specific way, and you said he seems to have this occult understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And you were kind of reading it like an allegory, like there is a correct meaning, like it's an encrypted meaning in this metaphorical language. And I think that Deleuze probably wouldn't be that into just like finding that one meaning there,
I wasn't necessarily claiming that was the correct one, but I just thought that this showed that I think Morrison was tapped into some things, and I liked what he was saying. I wasn't saying, well, this is the correct one, but I think that I do like interpreting art a lot, and I do have interpretations for art, and I do a lot of that where I'm like, but I'm not out of a sense that like I've got the right answer, but like, hey, if it's really good art, it should actually generate a lot of good interpretations because it's very well connected. See, I have this sense of just being devoted to the continuity, the continuous, the connected, And so the discrete tends to always like, it always just feels like a barrier to me that I want to push through and so again, for Deleuze, the abstract and the concrete, or the general and the particular, he doesn't really like that whole scheme because it's hierarchical, right? You have, and so when you think relationally, and this is actually modeled in the symbolic logic of category theory, where there's levels of abstraction, but the base is always just another abstraction, and so everything's just relations within relations, and so what you really want is to think of everything in terms of the singular. So every single relation or distinction you make is in a way singular, but it's also continuous. And so the things themselves aren't discrete. They are a particular pattern of relation to everything else. And so everything's continuous, but then it's not all just de-individuated into some mass. It's everything is related, but everything has to be approached within conditions. And so the art and science of life is, well, what kind of conditions and connections and selections are going to get what results. And that's why I think what we need to do is get back to, there should be a kind of science of metaphor, of sympathetic magic, of art. And that's what I think the traditional cultures, especially the good ones like the ancient Chinese had, is that everything was an art and everything was a science, because everything was about achieving harmony in your life, in the community. And so everything, all that was kept in mind. All the selections were, how would this affect everything? And there is no necessarily foundational science, because things are always changing, but there can be a kind of metaphysical science of like how relations are changing. And so I think divination is so important for ancient cultures, because they had an idea that, well, a true art and a true science needs to kind of keep up with the changing relationships of us and our society to the universe. And so that's why astrology and all these things are important. When you bracket all that off and you just try to have some kind of foundational system and truth, like you do in Western science and traditional philosophy, then yeah, you miss all that. And then you have this scheme of abstract, concrete, and then you're just like caught in this hierarchy and you can't get out, and everybody wants to transcend it. But when you're really like immanent and related to everything, then it's all about moving and navigating within that infinite network.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that what you just said, because when I read your work, Adam, I tend to think of, wow, you're operating on a very high level of abstraction. And that's where I was prompted to think, well, it would help the reader a little bit if you would throw in a metaphor or an example or an illustration, like, oh, I was going to the store the other day, for example, and I did, or something like that, to just kind of give you a little concrete.
No, I mean, that's a totally valid criticism. And I mean, I do think of that, and then I end up like putting it in the end notes, because if I put it into the body sometimes, and I do sometimes, but obviously not very much, but if I do, it sometimes feels like I'm bringing it down to a notch too far. And so it's like that goes in the end notes, where like if you want to know like kind of more concretely what I'm talking about, and then you can pause and look at the end notes. But like I do kind of want to maintain a kind of level of I don't like the word necessarily abstraction, but yeah, a level of continuity of connections that a more explicit poetic text would obviously be much more grounded in. And so I definitely think distinctions are fine, and yeah, I think there are always going to be different kinds of culture, and I think that's fine that modernity's gone that way. I just want to see them more interconnected, and some texts can be more abstract, some more concrete. Science can be more technologically oriented, and philosophy can be more theoretically oriented. But if they can kind of ground in this metaphysics of immanence that I'm putting forward, I think that there would be better versions of all these things, because they would be able to connect and inform and help each other in a much better way.
So for you, let's say that if I know you don't particularly like this word, but just for sake for at the level of abstraction that you're is not something you see as you see that as a form, a type of form of concrete approach, because you're dealing with terms and concepts that you think you have presented in a way that are fairly clear and approachable. And then the more you develop the network, the more you're building out
I mean,
a
I try. I don't know if I succeed, but for me, like thought is very sensuous, and so that's for me the difference between maybe a lot of academic writing and abstractions, because they tend to be more dry. And I know a lot of people reading my text will probably think it's very dry too, but at least for me, and then the texts that I do really like that are, Sri Aurobindo's pretty dry for people. Even his poetry is pretty dry for people, but there is a kind of imagistic continuity going on there, and that's something that I think you might not probably get that's not what I get when I think of the word abstraction, first of all, and it's definitely not what I get when I read a lot of abstract, like academic thought, because there's something like elementally missing there. Like there's some water missing there. It is very hot and dry and airy, and it's missing the water of feeling.
your writing is a lot more interesting than the analytic philosophy.
Yeah, like
That could be that stuff can be really dry.
Oh yeah, Adam's stuff is like pornography compared to that.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. So
I mean, I want it to be, it's, I know it's not going to be central and imagistic to a lot of people, but to me it is. And then I am trying to kind of.
In what way?
In what way?
Yeah.
Well, the concepts that I write are immediately invoking feelings because they're connections to so many concrete things, right? And so if you don't have necessarily the connections, maybe, yeah, it won't be that for you. But I try to get it to a level where I don't use a lot of jargon, so at least there's a potential to get some of the connections that I am feeling when I'm writing. And so obviously the more familiar you are with certain languages, then the more you're going to get out of it. But I would still hope that like there is some, like, at least in places, some residue at least of the image and the senses, at least what you would get. But it is on a more like spiritual level, like, so it's not necessarily the the sensual experience of sex like in explicit pornography, but in the sensual experience of, this is something that like Rudolf Steiner was very adamant about. And so he was very dry as well. And I guess he wrote some poetry. I've heard people say it's pretty bad. So maybe, maybe mystics and philosophers should just try not to do this. I don't know. But yeah, for him, like the thinking is about creating and connecting to these living realities of consciousness, and so it's not opposed to the concrete world or the physical world, but it is in a way what's behind it and generating it. And so that kind of thought, that intuitive thinking, as Steiner would call it, is very dense with relations, and that's why Deleuze also says that concepts are, they're not on a plane of reference like science, because they're not like referencing concrete things necessarily, but they are very dense with connections, and then those can be infinitely applied to concrete things. And so you can come at them with your own life history and your own associations, and they will enact that and create a central experience. But it'll be different for every person, rather than just like, oh, this is what this means. It just doesn't, it can mean anything, but it's an abstraction.
Can I try to add something? Can I just try to bring something else in that'll help us sort of maybe get out what you mean when you say that it's very sensuous for you? And if someone doesn't understand you, indeed, they're not going to have very many mental pictures when they read your writing. But as someone who, when I stick with your texts, I can understand you and follow you quite well. And I'm sure Greg can too. Like, you make a lot of sense. And so the experience for me may resemble the experience for you to some extent. I see a lot of, cosmic imagery when I read you. So it's not like, and that's the case with lots of philosophy, actually. When I understand philosophy, I do have a lot of mental pictures. But is that really the same thing we're talking about when we talk about the experience of reading a poem or hearing a poem?
I mean, like I said, there's a whole spectrum there. So obviously it's talking about different things. And so, I mean, when you read Rumi, for instance, like the Sufis especially, they had they're coming out of a poetic tradition that was very much about erotic love poetry. You know, the main image in Sufi poetry, for instance, is the footsteps of the lovers, like
Lotus petals.
no, the footsteps of the caravan in the desert, because they're coming out like, you know, oh, I just missed her caravan of camels or whatever moved on, and so
Right.
this image of like following the footsteps, and then that just gets transferred over into.
But the camel's hoof is like a lotus petal, I think.
Is it? I
Yeah.
mean, Lotus, I think, would be more farther east, but maybe, I don't know.
Well, anyway.
In any case, that gets transferred over to well, the beloved now is God, and so that image is then
That's where it loses me. I'm just kidding.
And they also talk about drunkenness, and they're Muslim. They're not supposed to be drinking, but the idea of drunkenness taken over from the earlier Persian culture is kind of used as a metaphor for the intoxication with God. And so they use a lot of more explicit sensual imagery to talk about these more spiritual cosmic things. And so yeah, that compared to, you know, Sri Aurobindo's poetry, which is, you know, rather arid. Yeah, there's
allegoric. I would say it's more allegorical. And that's why it loses people. And mystic intellectuals like, you know, Steiner. I haven't read Steiner at all, but Aurobindo, you know, it's interesting poetry. We disagreed about, like, I was like, I don't think it's the best, and but you know, it's worth, you know, reading. If I had a specific purpose, I would spend a lot of time reading it, but you know, there are other things to read. He strikes me as an allegorical writer, and when
allegory for what?
well, as you said, his thought tends to sorry, his poetry tends to lead back to almost like a doctrine. And I think that you read his doctrine, which you know very well. You've studied his doctrine. You see the doctrine in the poetry.
I wouldn't say a doctrine. I just think it's.
You didn't say that. That's true, but
I wouldn't say a doctrine either. Yeah, I would say it's a, you know, it's a vision. It's a mythological vision. I mean, Savitri is at the beginning. He says it's, you know, he takes the two main characters from Savitri. Savitri is the female divine word, and then Satyavan is the soul. But they're like two actual human characters from the Mahabharata that he takes, and he says, but this is not mere allegory. He says in the author's note beforehand.
I'm sure he says that.
He says, well, he's saying like these, you know, these characters and forces are actual beings that, you know, so it's an allegory in the sense that it's relating to the spiritual worlds, and that's, I mean, you have read some of his book on poetry, the future poetry.
Yeah, only the first couple of chapters.
Yeah, so he was kind of hearkening back to mantra and to trying to use language as to convey a spiritual experience, and, so, and it's allegorical maybe in the sense of, yeah, it is relating to these specific spiritual planes and experiences and beings, and trying to help people get that experience.
Yeah, it was notable in what he wrote. Well, he sort of he does acknowledge the importance of images and so forth. For him, the most important thing a poem could have was like the right sort of cadence or mantra, or like a mantra like sort of sound. And it seemed like he was very interested in capturing this new kind of or creating this new kind of prosody that would bring about, you know, almost like a spiritual breakthrough, and that would have the force of magic or something like that. And I feel like that makes sense for him, because he is someone whose words and metaphors don't seem to align very strongly with feeling. Like, I think in poetry, metaphor is so central, but it usually is the kind of metaphor that leads back to emotions, as well as, you know, abstract ideas. But the most essential thing about lyrics seems to be that its metaphors are like symbols of emotions.
And I think that's where the difference is that with, I mean, the whole idea in spiritual mystical thought is enlightenment, right? And so enlightenment really literally starts, it's the beginning of the spiritual path, but it's the end of, I mean, one Buddhist once said, like, it's basically the waking up out of the world of emotion. Now, most people read that just like they read, like, it's the overcoming of desire. They read that as, oh, that sounds terrible. That sounds like it's going to be really dry and abstract, just like most philosophers sound to me as well. Like that's some of the reasons why people don't like philosophy. Like emotion is such an addiction and the central part of animal and human consciousness that thinking that something outside of it or something beyond it is just sounds incredibly boring. But and the point is, and I think this doesn't come across enough in Eastern philosophy, whereas I think Sri Aurobindo, especially Steiner, emphasize it, is that it's actually by overcoming emotion, you actually then get to true feeling, because feeling in a way is emotion without the baggage of conceptual attachment. And so the fact that you have all these attachments and so you read a poem and you get, oh, that reminds me of that time I fell in love, and I get this sentimental feeling, like that's an emotion, right? But that's different than the sensual and the feeling experience of this more abstract but more concrete, because more related and relational metaphor. It's no longer just associating to a few things like, oh, that time I fell in love, or oh, that
Well, I don't think that that's what it's. People just don't merely reduce the emotion to like some experience they had. That's usually
that's
not
the very far end. I'm not.
That's like
to,
usually people who don't. That's sentimental people who like the idea
that's
of poetry.
bad
Yeah.
poetry, right?
Yeah.
Especially is complete, as Harold Bloom says, is sincere, right?
The most sincere.
It's very sincere. It's like what my Angela is like. She's very sincere. It's just like
I can provide maybe a real life experience that could relate to this conversation, or this part of it. And it would be good to get your thoughts on this. I used to belong to a men's group, called it a men's group. And this was during the era when Robert Bly was very popular.
Mm-hmm.
And there was all this talk about Bly trying to, well, he had this critique of men in our culture and the way that we're raised, and that we're losing contact with what it means to be a man in our culture. And so he was trying to have men get together and talk about their issues, their problems, their fears, their weaknesses, their strengths, etc. Anyway, we had this men's group, and so we'd get around and say, okay, what's going on with your life today, Greg? And so I'd start talking, and then I said, well, that's good, Greg, but you're telling us what you think, but you're not telling us what you feel. And I'd go, oh. So I said, but the more I thought about that kind of thing, I said, for me, every thought is very closely connected with an emotion. And every emotion, for me, is very closely connected with thinking. I mean, in my world, and I don't know, if it's true for everyone, but in my world, every thinking is for me a very emotional process. I just try to think about, like we were talking about earlier, about ways to improve the world. That's what philosophy is supposed to be doing, And I would think, well, I'm concerned about improving the world because I care about people. I care about what's happening. I care about community and all these things. And that level of care is a deep kind of emotional connection with what's going on around me. And so when I try to analyze that and come up with some response to it, or some idea that might contribute in a beneficial way to improving things, or relieving some conflict or something like that, it's a very emotional thing for me. And even conversations like the one we're having right now is a very emotional kind of thing for me. I really get into it on a level that is not at all abstract. So I'm thinking that, for me, there's a connection between thinking and feeling, and maybe between philosophy and poetry in that sense. in that metaphor is a technique, a strategy for philosophizing, as Plato employed it many times, and it's also great in poetry, but it's also, I think, like a passageway between philosophy and poetry that is interesting, and maybe we've been talking about is that connection that there is a lot of feeling and thinking, and a lot of thinking and feeling, but there probably is a sense in which thinking gets so far removed that, like Nietzsche says, we've forgotten the connection or the metaphor from which a term derived. And
Exactly.
it's now sitting out there in some abstract sense, and we don't connect to it emotionally anymore. So there probably is that development as well. But
That's right there is the thing that bugs me the most, and why I'm so motivated to write what I do is because I see that in so much of our knowledge. And so a lot of what I write about is the structure of our knowledge, and not just that it's lost touch with our feeling, but it's lost touch with its meaning. Like it doesn't even, it's a metaphor for nobody knows what.
Hmm.
So I like right now I'm writing about the history of the concept of the gene, and like the virus and all these things in biology. I'm writing an essay on biology now because I want to focus on, but yeah, it's there's so many problems that happen when those metaphors lose their connections and become abstractions in the sense of being just a
Hmm.
general concept, as opposed to something that has a history, something that has relations that invoke certain feelings and other ideas. And so yeah, I'm all for there being poetry and philosophy, but I think they both I think poetry is a little more conscious of the connections, and philosophy needs to be more like
Yeah.
that. But I also think it would help poetry too if poetic thinking and philosophy were able to kind of get along better and contribute to more creative, intuitive knowledge building and culture building, and instead of having the arts and the humanities separate from the sciences, and the sciences just like getting us further and further. I write about this a bit about how they just basically they even make art difficult because they insert so many abstractions that no one understands, metaphors that are disconnected, that it's even hard to even do poetry or art because the realms that you can kind of signify are shrinking because science has inserted all these mediations between everything, so
So science is making things messier, you would say.
messier.
Yeah,
Yes,
but it thinks it's making things neater.
neater. And so and Deleuze even makes a distinction between like the clear and obscure. What's clear obscures things, and yet what is right, where yeah, if you're actually like making distinct meaning, it'll actually be not clear because it means so many things. But to actually try to really denote something, you're actually obscuring all the relations that you've shown trying to simplify things.
Hmm. Well, Mike, you said something earlier when you were talking about, I think it was about lyrical poetry, where um, um, the lyrical poet tries to evoke some emotion, and one way of doing that is to mention or cite or visualize an object that carries an emotion. Like, for example, a cradle, a baby's cradle. If you just mention the cradle or just the word cradle in a poem, it can evoke a lot of emotions,
Whole world, a whole atmosphere. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, right. And so particular objects that have that ability can really light up poetry. And that I think could be applied philosophically too, in terms of mentioning objects or things in your world that other people can identify with, that can kind of evoke what it is in general you're trying to get at.
Yeah.
A lot of writers have done that, right? You're a Deleuze guy, and he does that in some of his more experimental texts, but Nietzsche does that. Anyone who's like in the continental tradition is more thinks that, finds that a completely acceptable thing to do. And then analytic is like, we got to get away from it.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Good luck finding that in the analytic world. Yeah, it's something that, I when I would write years ago when I was a lot younger, didn't have very much experience in writing. And I attempted to do some poetry. I don't know if you guys have tried to write much poetry,
Were you
but
doing it with Robert Bly?
yeah, that's a period when I mean I for a while when I was in college, I got into trying to write some poetry. Um,
Okay.
and then later on in the 1980s and early 90s, with the Robert Bly men's group and all of that, I read a lot of Robert Bly's poetry, which I thought a lot of his poetry was really good, because he would do that. And in fact, he wrote a book. Was it called um, um, John, was it Saint John? The myth of John. It's escaping me, but it was a book in which he's talking about a famous fairy tale um, that served as the basis for his pointing out some things about how this myth helped men to develop in a certain way, to grow out of childhood into manhood. And this myth was a myth that helped with that transition.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wrote some poetry that helps with that process as well. So he had a connection making between myth and poetry in his work, and I think it was great. I really enjoyed it, but I wasn't a very good poet, I have to admit, in my attempts. When I read some of that stuff now, I say, "Ooh, I don't want anyone else to read this." So it's um it's not easy to write good poetry, I don't think. What about you, Mike? Do you write some poetry as well as analyze it, or?
He's got a book published actually.
I've always written poetry, and I don't know. I haven't always been. No, I feel like I've always been a philosopher, but I don't know. I've always spontaneously done it. Uh,
Nice.
But yeah, he
What,
just published Dreaming at Noon.
oh, you don't have to plug my book.
no, I'd like to look into it. Dreaming at Noon. It's great.
I'll send you one.
It's a great title. Yeah, I would like to read it. Um,
I'm glad to hear that you wrote poetry at least, even if you don't want to share it. Because yeah, my opinion of you has been so much through text. It's been great to finally get to talk with you in this medium and get more of the human side of things, because text can be kind of abstract. And I
yeah.
think back in the day when we were just writing, we talked a bit about myth, and maybe that had something to do with politics. I don't know, but I'd be interested to like have you talk a little bit more about myth and its relationship to media and culture, because
Mm,
Mike's,
mm,
as Mike was starting to say, he thinks that there's some really important things about myth and the way that they affect culture. And maybe I'm read you wrong, but the things that you have said about myth, especially in your books about media, have been more like putting it along the lines of melodrama, and so there's almost this sense I have that maybe you think that the rational is more aligned with the tragic and the liberal and all that, and then on the other hand, the mythic is more of a backwards conservative relic or something. Am I wrong?
mm, mm. Well, in this book I did, Our Faith in Evil, I distinguished, between melodrama, tragedy, and the myth, like the way that Joseph Campbell looks at myth. Um, and he has this formula of sorts, the hero with 1,000 faces and the journey of the hero, and supposedly a lot of filmmakers have used his writings on myth to help construct screenplays.
It's very effective too. It works,
Yeah, supposedly Star Wars was influenced greatly by Joseph Campbell's work, and so yeah, it's interesting, and I think about that, and I thought, well, myth is it's not a myth tends to at least a lot of them perhaps that we can identify. Well, no, that's probably an overgeneralization to say that. I was going to say that myths tend to, at least the type of structure that Joseph Campbell talks about, the mythic hero at the end is successful. He
Mhm.
completes his task, his trial, his journey,
Yeah,
and comes out with boons for the community.
exactly. And they doubted him before, and that creates the suspense. Like the hero has a weakness or something, and then
Hmm.
goes out into the world.
Hmm.
uh, he's like a lost cause, but he ends up facing all of his demons and comes back having conquered himself and really created himself anew with boons for the community, and he's like a hero to the community, and that's like the
Hmm.
most satisfying sort of trajectory of individuation many people could ever hope for.
Exactly, yeah, and that's not exactly a tragic structure,
No,
although Aristotle did say in his Poetics that a tragedy does not necessarily have to end sadly or say tragically. It can involve great stress and suffering for certain characters, but in the end, that a good tragedy, according to Aristotle, could end well for somebody. And but for most of the time, tragedies end tragically for the tragic hero, and that's kind of contrary to Joseph Campbell's structure of myth.
right.
So I didn't see that as analogous to melodrama. Melodrama often ends on a happy note for the melodramatic hero, but it has a very different take on the villain in a melodrama. The villain is pretty much evil incarnate in classic melodrama, and is basically an entity to be scapegoated. And then once we do that, we feel good because our violence in getting rid of the villain is celebrated. So,
Mel Gibson is so good at that. I determined. I rewatched Braveheart, and in many ways that does have the arc of a hero's journey, but it ends up being a tragedy, I would say.
mhm.
But yeah, the bad guys, the English elite who are just subjugating these Scottish tribes, they are so bad, and he makes them so bad that you just want them to have their heads exploded, which he does. He gives you, and people are like, "Yes, he's giving us what we want."
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of that when I was writing this book that bothered me because
yeah,
I thought it's just too simple. It's not how real life works. Real life is so much more complicated, and villains have motivations that are and they grow out of contexts that are more complicated, that have built who they are and made them the way they are to a certain extent. Not that they don't have choices, but so I just felt that was a too simplistic. And then at the end, you celebrate this, and then I feel audiences tend to go out and they think, well, that's the way we should approach conflict in the real world, is that we should identify who the villains are and get rid of them. That's kind of what we're seeing in our politics these
yeah.
days.
No, no, Mel Gibson movies, or at least that movie. I don't think Apocalypto is like that, but Braveheart is, a fascist myth.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could take any historical situation and translate into Mel Gibson poetics, and then you have a really bad guy and a really good guy, and you can just use this framework to manipulate people whenever you want to. If you're a
Mm-hmm.
politician, you can just tell them the story. We're these heroic people who are basically good. These people are basically bad, and they've been trying to stop us from flourishing, and they love it. They just love stopping us from flourishing,
Mhm.
and they're benefiting from it. And then you can just like annihilate them if you want to.
Yeah, it's like nothing stands in the way of you just trashing these people. It's like they deserve it. You know, it's like,
So that's bad myth. What's a good myth?
Like a mythic story. You mean like, or do you mean
Well, yeah, you mentioned that there's also good uses of myth and how important it is to even to contemporary society. And do you think that there's what way would you think myth should be reinstated or become more? You just equated. We both
I just think
look
it,
like melodrama, and Joseph Campbell gets associated with myth, and so I think everybody tends to kind of go there
he
when they
focuses
hear
on mythic
when they hear the
stories.
myth.
Mythic stories is the focus when most people use the word myth, and
Yeah,
people
you're using
associate
it
them.
differently. So
I use it in a broader way. So mythical narratives, are very useful, and they help people come into their own. You can guide a group of young men into adulthood using certain kinds of stories. And apparently some say that that's been going on since the Paleolithic, but in a much looser, basic sense, for me, myth is like something that we use when we're emotional all the time, and some people more than others. I mean, I've monitored myself my whole life, and yeah, I have a lot of weird mythical and magical thinking. And the more emotional I get, the more apt I am to just see connections everywhere. And schizophrenic people, they see connections everywhere too much, and then they have a melodramatic um, structure of thought.
Mm.
You know, they'll start telling stories where they're like Jesus Christ, and then they're evil lizard people or whatever who are oppressing them, and they're bearing this burden for the sake of humanity. And so mythical thinking does lead people in that direction.
sometimes, often, maybe.
And it leads in the direction of narrativizing as well, not just creating metaphors.
But I would just argue that it's the melodramatic structure that's the problem, and so I feel
Yes.
like maybe there's a huge disconnect at the root of maybe our cultural politics and our culture war, where on one side people are like trying to reject anything that is mythological or even looking at science in a less than literal way or a less than dogmatic way as being mythological and therefore potentially fascist and having that same melodramatic
Yeah.
structure. And then, we're all also being kept from our more natural, I think, or even supernatural consciousness that sees the connections we have, because the few people that do in our society, and this is another Deleuze-Guattari argument, is that the schizophrenic is a failed creative thinker, that the medically diagnosed schizophrenic.
Is that what D&G say?
Yeah, that the true,
they use the word failure.
Yeah, they think that it's the reinstatement of the kind of fascist state structure into that what they would call like a creative line of flight, and so they're all about like this kind of schizophrenic thinking, but then the schizophrenic is actually the failure at that because he is in a way falling back onto that melodramatic narrative, and that may be more of a symptom of modernity than it is actually of mythical thinking.
Yeah, so it's mythical thinking, on my view, should be integrated better into the personality and not use people. Like we should use it rather than it use us or be used by other people's mythical narratives. So it's in that sense kind of like a pharmacon. It can help, but it can also kill you,
Yeah.
It can be a poison. And so rather than trying to repress it, as scientism would have us do, we should be more conscious of these mythical tendencies in our thought, and embrace them.
Good point. And here's maybe a film we could take a quick look at. It's one that just, I don't know, it keeps sticking in my head and accounts for me as kind of like a modern myth, because it has elements of magic and mystery and multiple interpretations, but it's also highly provocative, and that is the film The Book of Eli. I don't know if you have both seen that.
I did see it back in the day. I have very vague memory of it, but
But it
I remember you
stars
writing about it.
stars Denzel Washington, and anyway, it seems the way I ended up interpreting it, it seems to take the book turns out to be the Bible, and it has this is like an apocalyptic.
I saw part of it on TV one time. Yeah, I remember that. It was just like a wasteland and
Right.
Yeah, it's just a huge. Supposedly after some great apocalypse, that they don't. It's probably like a nuclear war, but they don't say exactly what it is. But civilization is just gone, and people are struggling to even stay alive and find enough water and things like that. But the book, this one guy has this um, fanatic belief about the Bible as something that we need to, and all the copies of the Bible have been destroyed, and he's trying to find a copy because he wants to use the Bible and resurrect its teachings. And turns out that he finds out that Eli, who is played by Denzel Washington, has a copy of the Bible, and he wants to get his hands on it. But Eli is on some mission to transport this Bible because of some vision he had across the United States over to the West Coast. And this character played by what's his name, Gary Oldsman.
Gary Oldman, yeah.
And he's kind of the villainous character. Anyway, he's trying to get his hands on it. But to make the story short, the Bible that Eli has it turns out to be in Braille, and so when Gary Oldsman gets his hands on it, he can't read it, so but anyway, Eli finally gets to the West Coast, and but then you're left wondering, well, what is it saying? Is it saying something like, the Bible, the reason all of the copies of the Bible were destroyed is because people thought that it led to the conflict that created this apocalypse that destroyed civilization. And so they destroyed all the copies, and now Eli is going to the West Coast where there's somebody who has a printing press, and they're going to, uh, um, make a new copy of the Bible and start distributing it. And there's this place that's on Alcatraz where this guy is printing copies of the Bible and the Talmud and the Quran and these different religious books, and so they can be distributed again. And so you're left wondering, well, is this the salvation, the resurrection of civilization and humanity, or is this simply going to recreate the apocalypse that destroyed civilization to begin with? And so you're left wondering about what is the role of religion here? What are they saying? And the filmmakers are very deceptive about answering that question, when they're
Yeah,
asked.
because I don't remember it that well, but I don't remember thinking that at all. I thought maybe it was that religion and religious books were all destroyed, but I didn't think that it would be, oh, that was what caused the apocalypse. I thought maybe that it would happen beforehand, and then because for me it would just be obvious that what if it's it's a wasteland, it's a nuclear bomb or science of some sort, and along the way. But yeah, I can see how they having a religious apocalyptic narrative and having nuclear weapons is a bad combo. So I just didn't, that wasn't the first thing in my mind. I just assumed, oh yeah, the science like got rid of all the religious books because not because that they were like causing the, because I would think that would have happened before, right? Before the religion's bad, it's caused.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my concern too now is I think that as we move into this AI era is that there is going to be more and more of a push towards a cybernetic system and having, it's already kind of the case and on the stock exchange and there's basically just these AIs that are trading and determining the economy, and everything is getting more and more determined by this AI, and I think it's it's seductive because it's a neutral system. Apparently, that's the marketing.
It's like scientists without having instincts, you know.
Right. So yeah, they don't have any those bad emotions, and so get rid of religion, get rid of anything that divides us, and so now we'll just. But then I think that would be the end of humanity itself, because I think that there's a consciousness and a value within the AI that is not human and not necessarily bent on humans being around. Maybe not like the Terminator or the Matrix, but who knows? Like I think our sci-fi films are definitely onto something, and every particular one has a unique spin on the potential dangers. But
Like a modern myth warning us about going down certain paths.
yeah, that's something John David Eberts that he wrote about before he kind of lost his mind.
Huh.
I don't think he's lost.
You don't think he's lost?
In one of his books? Which book did he write about that in? Or
Celluloid Heroes and Mechanical Dragons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, I think that myth needs to, like Mike said, get a more conscious deployment in our culture, and because it being scapegoated as the scapegoat. So Greg and I have talked a lot about scapegoating too, because I think there is this tendency. It's a more childlike instinct to have this like you were saying, that teaching children or adolescents kind of need melodrama, because it is a kind of way of building up the ego and individuating. Left to itself, and especially as a kind of childlike narrative to rule culture, it's a recipe for disaster, especially when cultures meet and they all have their own kind of individuation myths at the forefront. But having some mythical understanding is necessary for us to really navigate the value system of science, because science is very complex, and the values that are involved are difficult to see sometimes, which is why I'm always harkening back to these ancient symbol systems in the occult, because they use myth and symbolism as a way of simplifying complex systems and being able to see through a lot of the complexity that's obfuscated by the false clarity of technocracy.
Yeah, that's one reason I wrote Our Faith in Evil, because I was concerned about, and I was thinking that film does represent kind of like a myth-making industry in our society. And we love these stories we tell ourselves, and they have an influence. And I was concerned about, well, okay, if these are really myths that we're telling ourselves, and they do have an influence, especially on kids coming up who don't have, let's say, a cultural background that would enable them to have as a good a kind of critical orientation toward them, but just more of an accepting orientation. And there's some dangers that poses if certain things are structured certain ways in those myths, like, for example, violence.
Like in ancient cultures, was it as common to have super melodramatic myths where different groups would be evil and different other groups would be good? I feel like that just might be more emotionally. I mean, it might work on an emotional register for contemporary audiences. That doesn't mean it's good, though. I mean, so people are just writing these myths, and they are myths, I agree with you, without thinking about, and we're not even vetting the people who are writing them. They just do whatever works and whatever makes money.
Right.
Scapegoating gets a lot of people's attention.
Yeah. Well,
Like
yeah.
fascism works.
A good old revenge tale.
Yeah. There are great revenge movies, though, but when you're talking about large groups of people taking revenge on another group, it's always a bad idea. Count of Monte Cristo, I think, is pretty good. Have you ever read the story or seen the
I've seen
90s?
a couple of versions of it in film, yeah. And I read the story a long time ago when I was a kid, but so yeah.
So you're familiar with it. I mean,
yeah.
It's about two friends, and one of them is super jealous of the other, similar to Othello almost.
Yeah.
And then one of them undermines the, one of them undermines the other, and the other just doesn't see it coming at all. And then he becomes almost Machiavellian when Dantes is in prison. He's like in prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
He becomes super smart and savvy, whereas he was illiterate previously. And so all he can think about is revenge. And so that kind of thing, that's all right. That's about someone creating, that's about someone getting unlucky and getting effed over by somebody and then improving themselves. And then in the end showing that they're above mere revenge and that they could go back and accept love again from, he gets his woman back,
Mm-hmm.
and he ends up joining society again.
Mm.
And that kind of thing is good. And that's a good revenge tale, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
because it shows someone creating virtue, developing virtue in themselves, or just making themselves stronger and more powerful in a way that they ultimately use for good ends rather than ill ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Les Miserables is another example of a story that kind of looks like a melodrama, but has a really interesting twist to it. And those kinds of stories, and Moby Dick is another one, where the white whale appears to be the ultimate source of evil in the universe. But then you're finally figuring out that, well, maybe the captain doesn't have it quite right here toward the end. So they make you think, and I think I end up calling those reverse melodramas, where you're led down the melodramatic road, and then all of a sudden the rug is pulled under you, and you say, "Whoa, wait a minute, I've got it completely backwards." It's like the good guy is the bad guy, and the bad guy's the good guy, and now I don't know what to think anymore. And so stories like that complicate conflict a little bit, I think, are much more interesting and much healthier, and they really make you think about life.
Yeah, I really like those movies where the bad guys, they're not really bad guys, but they are positioned as bad guys. But the movie lets you see that they just happen to be in a position where they're like basically doing their best. And
Mm-hmm.
but from a certain perspective, when you're empathizing with the protagonist, they do seem like bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When the perspective shifts, that's a good move, and I think it's healthy. And that's what more movies should do.
Yeah, that's my feeling too. And frankly, I think good poetry can do a similar thing. It can arouse, can make people think about life a little bit differently. And, if they're in a depression, it might be able to take them out of their depression, or make them think about why they're in a depression, make them question certain things, or make them feel um, toward various things in a slightly different way. And it's really interesting how it can work that way in poetry.
And you mean like lyric poetry, right? You mean,
Yeah, yeah, even very short poems, lyric poems can do that. Of
yeah, they
course,
definitely take us out of our rigid categories. Poetic language can just do that. Allows for better, if I were to talk like a neuroscientist, it allows for better, connectivity across hemispheres, right and left.
mm,
Um, and it integrates feeling more with thought. It actually strengthens those connections between feeling and thought. And
mm,
brings up memories, so it can be used in a therapeutic way, just like all art can do. And the way you talk about art, you sort of emphasize art's capabilities of sort of emphasizing ambiguity. That art, like, we live in a culture that takes us away from ambiguity with these strict categories, and art is sort of like a nice release valve and puts us back in touch with ambiguity. Of course, this is not the highest form of um, art, merely showing ambiguity,
mm.
just breaking down categories.
Well, I think anything that's merely ambiguous would not be ideal, but ambiguity, what people perceive as ambiguity, should potentially have a lot of connections that are going on, not just confuse people and be like, "Ooh, what does it really mean? I don't know." Well, that's cool. Like,
Yeah,
it's a mystery.
that's not a good stopping point.
No, you want it to invoke new ideas and connections. And for me, like Greg's work helped inspire me too, to say, oh, well, the way people consume media, that really affects the way that they're going to approach life. And I think what you're talking about with ancient people, the way that they thought that their language and their stories actually had a magical effect. I mean, I think that I've talked to Greg about this recently, that this is where everything's headed, that there is an occult science, if you will, behind all of this, that, as I was saying earlier, it's not something that can be foundationally represented, but everything, the kinds of language and thoughts that we use and the kinds of art that we do, all of that has an effect on the kind of reality that we both perceive in the moment, and definitely how it structures the direction we're headed in our lives, and especially in society. So yeah, I think bringing myth back and understanding art and science in a way that has that in mind. I know that does. I bring this up also because I maybe just want to, if you do want to touch on politics, like this does kind of bring us to that question of to what extent is that appropriate? Because if I start thinking along the lines of, well, as I do, like, and I think this is what occultists used to do. This is the idea, was that there was kind of the really smart ones that were seeding religions in order to influence culture. And they could do that in a potentially good way, and some of them did it in a bad way to kind of just maintain power. And then we kind of then think of religion in the more allegorical sense, where they just had dogmatic beliefs about what things mean. But even those symbol systems, when they were dogmatically believed, they were created as a kind of magical spell to begin with, because of the effect it would have on society. And so to what extent is myth and religion appropriate now, and having this kind of more magical but also potentially contemporary scientific understanding of the magic and of the way that we structure our knowledge and our language, to what extent is that appropriate in politics, or is that perhaps too dangerous and potentially fascist? Greg?
Well, that's a topic. Yeah, we should maybe think about that. I'll touch on it briefly, but we should maybe think about that as something we could talk about more down the road, because I do have a lot to say about that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's potentially dangerous, because I believe in that notion of demonstrability that we talked about last time. And I think demonstrability is important from a collective point of view. If we can't give good reasons for certain uses of words, language, stories, and decisions that we make, if we can't give good reasons for them, if we can't provide some way of demonstrating to the general public why we should go down this road as opposed to some other road, then if it's just based on authority or some insight or some claims to something as esoteric as astrology, or people were making a big fuss back in the Reagan administration when they learned that Nancy was playing around with astrology, and they were thinking that maybe some of the decisions getting made in the White House were being made based on astrology and the advice of an astrologer. And people were like freaking out, like, whoa. So
that's so much scarier than Reagan making decisions that like the private sector is telling to make. It's so much scarier.
yeah.
It's so much scarier than very self-interested individuals being like, "I need you to make this decision on everyone's behalf, but really on our behalf."
So as an astrological theorist, can you
Well,
maybe
who's still
okay? Yeah, I just wanted to hear your rebuttal, but if he wasn't finished, that's fine.
No, I mean, think about it from Reagan's standpoint. I mean, he's like, I'm president now. I need to be like every other king in history and have an astrologer.
Well, yeah, I would not object to his using an astrologer, but I would object to, and not that they did this, and to their credit, maybe that they didn't, because it only came out as a revealed secret. But if he was using it to justify certain decisions, then
That'd be crazy.
then I think we could be in trouble. But if he's using it as a method of trying to analyze and break down situations and discover factors that may be in play and things to consider in making a decision, then I think astrology could be useful. But I think that it should not be, if you go out into public and you explain, well, I decided to go to war with Iraq or something because my chart indicated that this was the best thing to do. Instead of saying, well, even if you're lying about it, WMDs was the reason why we went into Iraq. If you don't provide some reason that people can wrap their mind around, the general public and people who say know nothing about astrology, then
What if we had a culture of that were more astrologically adept? And then you said, well, I mean, for instance, at the place I work, everybody's very into astrology, and our owner is very into astrology, and he'll be like, okay, no, we can't have the meeting here because of Mercury retrograde. He makes a lot of decisions based on that. But everybody in our store knows, oh yeah, okay, sure.
okay. Yeah, if everybody's on board, then it begins to make more collective sense. But when you have a diverse population where people believe have different religious backgrounds, or non-religious backgrounds, or different secular, ethnic origins, and come from different parts of the world, and you have this melting pot like the US and so many other countries have now. And I think you need to stick to something that is more demonstrable.
Yeah, definitely. Like, what if it's most people want peace, and that means that your leader needs to get along with the leader in Iran, and the leader in Iran, we have his birth chart or something, and then we have our leader's chart, and we find out that the reason that our leader is negotiating with Iran's leader is because like they have incompatible charts. And it's like, well, you need to do that. Like, you need to do what's right in principle for the right reasons, not merely for this reason that science hasn't even recognized as valid, right?
Interesting. Yeah, I think any time that you can find an excuse to negotiate, that's a good thing. Negotiation is what is often precluded, though, when decisions are based upon
Exactly.
kind of autocratic decisions that are founded in reasons that are not given, like in the old autocracies, kingdoms, and whatnot, where people would make a decision and they weren't required to give any explanation for it. It's just, oh, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't think that works anymore in the information age. There's just too
No.
much information going around. People need reasons, and sometimes rational reasons don't have any impression on people at all. There's they have to be appealed to on some other basis, but of reasoning with quotes around it. But just an autocratic stance, I think, is a danger. And that, like Putin and Xi, I think, are operating too much out of that framework. Thoughts?
Well, we've talked about that before. Yeah, I don't. Autocratic and mythological aren't necessarily the same for me. It's autocratic, or and with democratic is usually just as I said last time. Often just they have a more, like us, we have a more sophisticated form of manufacturing consent, and so the supposedly autocratic have a more primitive form, or they don't even need consent, as you're saying, and they just do whatever they want. But yeah, I think that there can be a postmodern culture that's more steeped in myth and art and not so scientistic. And I think postmodern philosophy could help make that transition. And so that's what I've written about recently, about how just this kind of re-embrace of understanding things as signs helps to think more relationally and less dogmatically. And I don't think that science and strict denotation or strict demonstration necessarily are what prevent dogma and autocracy. I think what does is being aware of context, and that allows you to negotiate and have more diverse perspectives in play. And I think but it can lead to chaos as well. I think that's probably the problem with democracy, and why rulers understandably have to manufacture consent, because if this is what I think Plato was worried about, is that if you do have the chaos of competing interests, and you don't have some kind of collective vision, then that's a problem. But establishing that collective vision and in negotiation is, I think, more possible when you do have an understanding of knowledge as constructed, not as constructed out of nothing, but that it's that conditions that you put on it really affect the direction of civilization and culture. And so we should do it as part of a community. But to do that, to really have any way of orienting in that chaos of infinite perspectives, I think mythological and symbolic thinking and intuitive thinking, not just and so I think philosophy has an important role to play in orienting ourselves within this infinite network of possible symbols that you can get lost in, all these possible meanings. And if without philosophy, or without like this ability to kind of parse different and weigh different intensities of sign relations, then you can kind of devolve back into a kind of primitive magical thinking. But understanding that, there's not having the dogma, thinking, okay, well, this way of thinking will produce potentially some result, not because I'm just superstitious, but because I have some understanding of all these contexts. But then there's always other contexts. So I'm not dogmatically like saying this is the way to go, and we can have that kind of relational, open network, discursive way of kind of my vision is kind of a marriage of democracy and and some kinds of autocracy, sometimes some kind of like simplification of a cultural project that can
to avoid bureaucracy,
and just competing interests lead to chaos. And like this is the same thing that we're dealing with in the store that I work with, like in a lot of natural food stores, real co-ops, like it's just kind of known that they're the worst places to work, because everybody, it just becomes competing factions, and everybody just hates each other. Like we have kind of a benevolent dictator at our store, but he's getting old, and now he's kind of leaving the store to our mission statement. And so then there's a kind of complex kind of small but complex, legally complex bureaucracy of like certain people that can basically protect the store's devotion to its mission. And so there's principles that are in charge ostensibly, not necessarily one person, but not just chaotically like ruled by the factions fighting.
Well, two quick things on that. One is that I think it relates in a sense to what we were talking about earlier, in the way in which by analyzing or discussing or investigating or understanding the myths going around in our culture, we can gain from that. But also, in a sense, there can be too much diversity if, for example, like if you look at the American Constitution as like the myth upon which this country is founded, the myth of equality and freedom. Those are pretty big myths, but that's what people have for decades referred to. That's the mythology on which has brought us together as a nation. And now it seems to be that there's a lot of different interpretations and different mythological offshoots coming off of that, like, the Constitution was a Christian myth, the Constitution was it's a secular myth, and all of these contradictory ways of looking at it. But I don't know if that's going going to lead to ultimate division, or if it's just a healthy temporary conflict going on to sort these things out. But it seems like we need a myth that will unite us if we want to stay together as a country.
A lot of our country's founding myths were ideals, and now they're these realities that people think really existed in the past, rather than being an ideal for the future. So by locating the ideal in the past and turning into a myth, people are like, it was better then, and people are preventing us from having what used to be the golden age, right? And so then you can blame certain people for taking away the golden age, so you could have
Right.
it back again. So like the ideal is fine, ideal is something that you want to asymptotically, you want to get closer and closer to it, but you know that it's maybe not attainable.
That's yeah, one thing I really like about Derrida is he talks about that in terms of perfectibility. An ideal is not supposed to be something that was either true in the past or that will necessarily become true in the future. It's like a carrot in front of the donkey. It leads you forward. It provides a light that guides you and toward a kind of perfectibility, which is kind of infinite. It just perfectibility takes place ongoing. And if you get confused and you think about it as something that is attainable or something that was attained and we've now lost,
Right.
then trouble starts.
That's when it turns into a bad myth.
Yeah, exactly.
Ideal into myth.
Which I think we have some of that going on in our country now. It's not helping. So, but yeah, that's something I think we could talk about for quite a while. It's different ramifications of that. But so what do you think? Is it getting close to time to wrap up, or do you guys want to hit on some other thing before we do? Where you at?
Well, you mentioned that you really wanted to share your takedown of Trump with me. If you want to do that, if not, that's fine too.
No, I can't do that. I start talking about Trump and I'll turn into a fanatic. You won't be able to reason with me. And I'll
Start thinking
become,
mythically. You'll
oh
start
yeah,
thinking.
I'll become the opposite of what I have advocated. So that would be bad.
Had you ever heard, I don't want to dwell on this either, but did you ever hear Steve Bannon praise Trump for being like very well read, and in Jung specifically, he's read a lot of Jung according to Steve Bannon, and he knows how to manipulate symbols, and he's very
I never
savvy
heard
with
that.
archetypes, and so he knows how to connect with the masses in a way that is like beyond rational understanding, because he taps into the mythic mind.
Well, I would agree that he knows how to tap into the masses in an irrational way, but I don't think it's anything a conscious strategy or a product of deep learning on his part. I think it's just narcissism and what narcissists like to do. They like to elevate themselves constantly, and they have explanations for everything good that's happening based on something they did. And so I think it's part of a disease or a symptom of a disease that he has,
Isn't
rather
that
than.
just good politics though? If you like, take credit for everything, and if you can convince people of that, then
Well, politicians tend to want to do that, sure. It's like every politician wants to take credit for the economy, but the economy really, I think, has very little to do with who's the president. Has a lot to do with a lot of other factors, but um, yeah, I mean, that's one road I think a wrong turn that politics has taken is like where politicians take claim for things that they really have no right to take claim for. I would rather they talk about their policies, okay, this is what I believe and this is where I think we should go and this is what I think we should do, what your agenda is, what your policies are, and then let the chips roll where they may, and if good things happen, then great, people may support you, and if bad things happen, then well, obviously you didn't have the right formula. So I'd rather see what their agenda is, but there's very little talk about agenda anymore, and there's just, destructive talk about what Republicans are doing and what Democrats are doing, killing babies or not killing babies or whatever.
Yeah, just wedge issues that mythologically get people worked up, you know.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
myth clearly has so many problems, and it's exploited by politicians. And that's another reason people should be more in touch with mythical thinking, because they're being used by it rather than
Exactly. Yeah.
rather than understanding themselves better or connecting with others interpersonally more effectively.
Maybe I think it also it's a rational, reasonable understanding of maybe the role of the president in electoral politics is that the bureaucracy is going to basically stay the same no matter who wins. And so all these details, maybe shift a little bit depending on who's in
Whoa,
charge.
whoa, 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 whoa. Wait, no, I don't agree with you on that point. Take a look at the Supreme Court. It mattered who was president, and it mattered who was appointed to the court.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but I'm saying that what matters more is that like, especially like Supreme Court and abortion, like it's the more the value issues than it is like the function of the bureaucracy and or the politicization of the economy. Like you're saying, like the economy is probably not going to be that affected, and which probably determines a lot more of people's lives and what happens to them. Foreign policy, like pretty much the CIA runs that, and anybody tries to change that, that's what makes the most difference of people all around the world. What does make a difference between who one person and the other? Well, it's the kind of myth and the value sphere, and I think people have a sense that does have that it's not just an ideological sheen on top of the structure, that it does have an effect, but that effect is more occult or spiritual, if you will, that like isn't as tied to well what they do in specific circumstances, but like what is the general vision of what is America, where are we going, where are we headed? And then if they elect Trump, then there is, I think, very real differences, and but they're not necessarily as concerned, I think, in a somewhat reasonable reasons, that it's well, I don't care so much about these things that probably aren't going to change in my lifetime, but I want to believe in something. I think that's just a natural inclination people have to want to have a leader, and it's not just a weakness and a rational belief, that it is a kind of sense that like, well, the myths that we tell ourselves do have an effect on our lives, maybe in more of a sense than just like the shifting of the bureaucracy a little bit here or a little bit there.
Hmm.
You agree, Mike?
Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the behavior of the people being ruled and governed is influenced by having certain kinds of leaders. I personally think that Trump's people who like Trump are very gratified by having him in office. And that honestly, I don't enjoy being around really excited Trump voters. I just don't enjoy it. It makes them very certain kind of person very cocksure, and they go around gloating, and I haven't enjoyed it. As far as what Trump actually does in terms of policy is a different question. But to your point about the importance of leadership, I think that people especially want a leader that they admire, or who speaks for them, almost like almost as an extension of you. This can be very gratifying when you are somebody who doesn't have much faith that things are going to get better. And we have this instinct that makes us, we just become really unhappy when we become on some level sure that we're not going to do slightly better than the generation before us. And that's when the mythological larger than life leader becomes especially important. And to some extent, this theory would help explain where Trump comes from and why he was able to make an entrance at this point. You know, the economy really has failed, and it consistently since 2007, 2008. And you know, our generation, Adam and I, we haven't been able, you know, generally to do as well as the previous generation, as our parents. And this represents rupture in the American sort of ideology, in the narrative that we find, that we identify with being American. Our expectations are, in short, being disappointed. And for a long time, we've also had a culture war on our hands, where Republican voters see themselves in terms of their identity as being so just antithetical to what a liberal is. And a lot of that just has to do with lifestyle. Do you drive a pickup truck versus, you know, a Tesla or whatever, or like a Miata? I should Miata. Let's put it in the 90s rather than anachronistically. You know, I would never drive that. And like, you know, liberals, like going to New York City, I've seen a liberal just like sneer if they hear someone with a drawl, like, what is he doing here? You know, it's like, you know, there's a definite divide. And you know, as identity politics has really started to more and more shape the way people I mean, we've had to make a lot of adjustments because of identity politics, and that seems to correlate with the economy failing. And so it's very easy to see how Trump voters would really have a lot of ire for liberals. And Trump's just articulating what people had already been sensing. And like, look, I mean, so there is like some truth to it. I mean, liberal politicians maybe aren't doing us any favors. But I think that people make a fallacy when they assume that the guy just demonizing the status quo is the solution. He's exploiting a situation, and he's doing it, I think, for probably self-interested reasons. But I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time. I didn't spend a lot of time in his White House.
I don't think many people would argue with that. I mean, yeah, it's not, it doesn't come off as being too selfless, but yeah, the question is whether those optics are just optics, or if there is any, like, you know, real practical benefit for having somebody speak truth to power and actually, but then probably being just as bad, or maybe Greg says worse. But yeah, I would maybe argue that there, again, there is a kind of occult level of politics where language, maybe this makes me sound like I'm thinking magically, but in a pejorative sense, but I do think that, you know, just having somebody up there speaking truth to power, I don't think it's just a weakness on people to be drawn to that, to just finally, like, especially when you look at someone like Biden, who's literally, you know, just a kind of empty husk for the bureaucracy, you know, to have somebody up there with actual vitality, speaking truth to power in some ways, like, to whatever extent that he does that, to whatever end, practically speaking, in the moment, at least there's I think a legitimate spiritual sense that, like, at least, like, the words are out there and that might have some kind of effect on the world.
I agree. And I personally find it more gratifying when there's someone up there who has some kind of vitality, you know, for whatever reasons. You know, liberals tend to be very technocratic, and the technocratic preference is for leadership to be completely neutral, almost like an AI. I like having real leadership. I don't see a lot of it though. But what I do know is that what Joe Biden presents to us is not what people need during a difficult time. And so I see Trump as just, you know, candy. I don't like candy that much. I don't eat candy unless I'm fucking starving. I don't think people are starving that much that's I think that people that are basically children who are gratified by that level of sweetness, and they're
Hmm.
not even starving.
There's certainly people that do believe that he's the answer. There's a whole mythological, there's a definite like this whole QAnon thing where it's a myth that he's like is the answer, and there's this whole thing going on, and like there is that, but I think there is also a lot of people that don't necessarily, believe he's the answer, but just like, yeah, I mean, even just the comedians be like, oh, well, this is a lot more entertaining. That entertainment value isn't just entertainment either. It is like, there's a sense of vitality there as opposed to, not just because of Biden's like failing vitality or his age or whatever, but just because the bureaucracy itself is, I mean, when you use that word bureaucracy, you can't help but think abstraction, dry, devitalized, right? And so the fact that Trump can even just maybe little, well, maybe Israel needs to wrap up the war, and like it's not looking too good, like every reasonable person, I would say, knows that. But in Biden and can't say that because he's not really free. So the fact that even, oh, well, look, the Trump guy is at least free enough to say what no one in the bureaucracy, or at least the liberal side of the bureaucracy, can say. And so
Mhm.
that even that just that little thing of him just being like, maybe they should wrap it up pretty quick. If I got in there at like, and he's of course opportunistically being like, oh shit, like this is a great way to like win because people are like pissed at Biden for not, for keeping up his support of Israel, and so all he's got to do is just maybe gesture in the other direction a little bit, and
Yeah.
that's enough.
So
So it's opportunistic, but at the
he
least
he exploits, the situation where other people have their hands tied. But his real genius, I don't know but he really has a talent as a performer for making it seem that he is never compromised to make a decision, and that his decisions are completely autocratic or autonomous. Like he does what he believes is right on principle. And other politicians just don't have that. You don't get that sense about them, that they're making decisions that are free. They're like bad actors, and he's like a good actor.
Wait, you're saying that about Trump?
Yeah, Trump seems like a good. I mean, so he doesn't even seem like an actor. He hides his art, whereas your usual professional politician really doesn't seem like they have autonomy in their decision making. And
Well, here's the hypocrisy I see in Trump on that point is that, okay, so he's a guy who comes out of a rich family who has had a lot of opportunity in terms of the real estate businesses that he's been involved in, and the real estate he's purchased and made money
yeah,
on.
he's a nepo baby.
He
He's a
comes
nepo baby.
from this corporate side of things, which and then he makes this claim that to popularism, appealing to the urban areas and to the people who,
I agree. It's completely crazy that
it's like it's
how does he get away with this? He is your typical limousine liberal. That
yeah, exactly. He's from, based in New York. The guy is riddled with a certain way of looking at the world in which he wants to make a lot of money. I mean, everything he does, according to some people, is to make money and to increase his own personal wealth. But the thing is about the economy that I think maybe you guys are overlooking is that the economy is hurting in one sense, but not hurting in another. There seems to be, job creation, but the jobs aren't paying enough.
yeah,
The reason they're not paying enough is for guys like Jeff Bezos, who
yeah. So it's inequality, income and
this huge,
wealth inequality.
all of the money in the hands of very few, and it's not being spread around, and that's
And
why they're hurting.
Trump is emblematic of he's the kind of person who's made that a reality for us.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I see it, he has contributed to that corporate world
He's benefited from inequality, and
and so I don't see him as someone who can solve that problem. What we need is we need deep corporate taxation, and we need the tax laws to be enforced on corporations, and we need them to be forced to stop taking their money into overseas bank accounts.
But that would prevent us from competing with China, and then they'll enslave us. And that would be the view. That would be the response to your proposal. And so people just can't agree about how the economy is actually working.
True.
Yeah, because I think that it should be just, there should be in a perfect world, there would be a law that was enforceable where a person couldn't make over a certain amount of money, right? No one could have a certain amount of money.
I think billionaires should be, if you can't make more than $1 billion, that should be a law. Yeah. I mean, like, imagine, somebody who like, basically, a $500 million yacht, who needs that when your employees are having to struggle to even form a union so they can make enough money to pay the rent, and he's buying $500 million yachts. I mean, there's something deeply wrong with that. And he doesn't even seem to realize it. It's like, what's the problem? Well, yeah, you're making all the money. That's the problem. And these super wealthy billionaires are not connected to what the issue is, and that's that there has to be a greater spread of wealth in order to create a middle class that would support a democracy. You can't really support a democracy without a middle class. So
For whatever reason, since Reagan, though, Republican voters tend to be implicitly libertarian. And so people being better off economically comes down to the government staying out of our economy.
The hope
yes,
is that
that's
one day, the hope
precisely.
is that one day they'll be the guy on top.
Well,
So
yeah, that's the myth that they want to try to spread, but the reality is that that's not going to happen, and the problem is that capitalism needs regulation. I know for Republicans, regulation is the evil word. No regulation, laissez-faire, and that's going to make the economy work well. Well, we've seen what lack of regulation does to the economy now. It drives all the wealth into the hands of a few people. When you don't have regulation to prevent monopolies from forming. And the Federal Trade Commission is weekly attempting to counteract the monopolies in this country. And the head of the FTC has been working that direction, but they're a very small organization and they don't have good enough funding, and they have like 20 corporate lawyers versus one lawyer when they sue these corporations and take them into court, which is what's happening right now with Amazon and with Apple. They're getting sued by the FTC for monopolistic practices. And whether they're going to succeed or not, we don't know, because the odds are against them. There's just too much money on the side of these corporations. And my view is voting Republican is only going to exacerbate that situation. It's not going to correct it. The only way to get things going back in the right direction is to get regulated capitalism. And the only way that's going to happen is with a Democratic Congress to pass some laws that are going to strengthen basically taxation. You need to tax the rich more to get some of this money driving in a different direction. So I'm not a big fan of Biden either, but I see the Democratic Party as being the only party that's going to challenge the status quo in terms of how money is getting distributed in the country. The Republicans are gung-ho on, like Trump. He even came out the other day and said that he wanted to cut taxes even more. And that's going to only drive things much more in a worse direction. So those are some problems I see on that. Not only, for me, it's a party issue more than it is an individual, like Biden versus Trump. No, it's Democrats versus Republicans and their basic agendas, as those agendas have played out historically over the last decades prior or following 2000. So anyway, that's my political speech.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think everything you're saying makes sense in terms of where the world was at maybe 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. As I mentioned a little bit last time, I think the neoliberal era is over. And so I mentioned before also this book, Capital is Power, and they go into the kind of cycles of the economy, and they we talk about breadth versus depth. And so when there's a lot of emphasis on breadth, which means economic expansion, then yeah, the status quo, which means some sense the states, but mostly dominant capital, they're going to really emphasize like the libertarian free market thing. But we've already kind of shifted out of that, out of the kind of greenfield breadth regime, and now we've entered the depth regime. And so there is a kind of more of an emphasis on depth, which means like basically shrinking the economy, but it's good for the dominant capital because their relative power next to all the other corporations and power structures.
It's just like vertical versus horizontal. Is
Right.
that what,
Yeah, breadth, depth. And so now we're in and so in the vertical regime, there's going to be more emphasis on state control. And so they use both. They use the right and the left, the vertical and the horizontal, for their own ends. And right now, so the reason I think, and it's not just a normal depth regime right now. It's not just a normal like cutting the economy and increasing relative power for these few dominant capital positions. I think it's also there's a huge globalization thing going on that has to be kept in mind. And I think there's a concerted effort to concentrate power in certain things that are not traditional and don't fit into the whole neoliberal economic critique, because things like the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization, for a while it was going to be this whole Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's going to be a lot of like laws set up to really regulate the economy. So it's never really been about regulation versus unregulated. There's always regulations. It just depends on who they benefit. And so they use different language to get certain things done. But in the end of the day, as you I'm sure know, it's going to be those dominant capital entities and positions that are going to benefit. But right now, yeah, I think there's a more of a cooperation between the dominant capital entities and the states, and that they're forming more of a kind of integrated network. And although there are outliers, as I said last time, I think that this is, I think what a lot of people, if you there's the average Republican voters, people, older people that like have been voting Republican and still watch TV, but a lot of the young people, and there are a lot of young people that are into Trump and or definitely not into Biden if they're voting, if they're maybe not voting. They're more concerned about globalization and they're more maybe conspiracy oriented, but in general. And so that's kind of that's a part of it. But there's a general kind of resistance to globalism. And so I've talked with some people on the far right even, and they're very into nationalism and they don't necessarily like Trump, but they're on the right because they want more nationalism, because they see this consolidation of power globally and this technocratic structure arising, and the state power becoming more scary and potentially dystopian than it had been before in the neoliberal era, where it was all about unregulated capitalism, and so the state regulations, well, that seems like a good sign of something that could benefit people more. Definitely, like taxes, like welfare state. Now the welfare state seems to be what they're actually, they have their own vision of the welfare state, and it's coming, and people are wanting to slow that down and have something more regional.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, you're saying, for instance, Trump's people basically understand the global situation where you have
I don't know about understand, but they're like tuned into that.
Yeah. And so redistribution may even weaken America, right, from their point of view.
Yeah.
And alien or bad actors, bad states could get the better of America. And so No, if that's
And
what you believe, then
bad states, or just, yeah, this maybe
bad states that are
the global,
aligned.
you know, you listen to your Alex Jones, who's the globalists, like that's like
Right.
that's the umbrella term often, like, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Alex Jones or whatever, but you know, that is he's kind of speaking mythically to a similar impulse, that like there's, you know, a global thing that's not just, and it's not just appealing to people that have some kind of sentimental attachment to America. I think it is a kind of, I think, and maybe it gets conflated and tied up with that, but I think there's on some level for a lot of people a legitimate intuition that technology and technocracy are dangerous, and that there's a global, that this emerging cybernetic state is a global entity, and so there's a instinctive impulse towards conservatism and nationalism as some kind of
Yeah.
stopgap to that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, people don't have much faith in becoming rich, but they may see that the world is reaching a critical, we're at a point of crisis where globalism threatens to absorb America and just annihilate it completely. And Trump is like, we're gonna maintain our identity, and we're gonna be on top in spite of all of this. And I'm gonna fight this dragon called globalism. And so people they're less interested perhaps in being well off or the economy being fixed than being on the right side.
Right. Exactly. There's, and I think there's maybe some legitimate mythological reasons for that that you know, appeal to me as well, and that's why I feel a little bit drawn to defend them. Although I don't necessarily identify with one side or the other, I see the appeal, and I see that there is some reason for that. I mean, I think, look at COVID. Like, if you want to look at states just arbitrarily doing whatever they want to business, like they can do it. They still do it. They did it, and that's not stopping. Like that impulse, that regime, that kind of hierarchical, as I was saying, that depth regime where they can just be like, okay, like all all the little players and the capitalists, all the like minor capitalists and the, you know, the petty tyrants of the economy can get cut out in an instant. And but who benefited? Well, yeah, definitely Bezos and Amazon and all the tech guys. So this is, you know, Varoufakis, this whole thing, this is techno feudalism. There's a few feudal lords, and then, you know, most of the capitalists are just having to become like basically vassals at this point. And that's a scary thing for people, and they're no longer like, oh well, it's just about the economy. It's like the economy is turning into I mean, what they experienced over COVID. Everyone got it's not just a conspiracy theory, because people lived it. A lot of people, like, they're at a whim were told where to go and what to do. It wasn't so bad here, but it was really bad in Australia and certain places. Like, people were you know, were treated in a way by the government, acting on behalf of just a few corporations. And that's not capitalism. That's not the market run wild. That's power.
Well, interesting, but I'm sorry to say I disagree.
That's okay.
Yeah, just quickly, I tend to view it in the other direction. I think that all of these world autocracies are on the ropes. They are on the verge of collapse. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia. You can go down the list. Every dictatorship, every autocracy in the world, their economies are a mess. And there's a reason for that. That is because a dictatorship and a democracy just don't work. And the United States has proven over and over and over again through the decades since the founding of this country that a version of capitalism is the way to generate a solid economy and a middle class. Now, I know a lot of people don't want to hear that talk, but that's what I believe, and I think it's been demonstrated through history. And I cannot believe that China, which was coming out of its funk economically because they were becoming more capitalistic, and they were allowing some entrepreneurship and some businesses to develop and some innovation to develop. And they were coming, and now she is repressing, people socially and economically and politically, and they are going downhill fast. And there is no escape for them. I mean, they've already gone past the point of no return. So China, I think, is defunct. There's no hope coming from China. And there's also no danger coming from China. China has got enough problems within its own borders. It's not going to attack Taiwan. It's not going to help Russia. It's barely able to help itself at this point. So I think the things that look good are democracy and capitalism, but it has to be regulated capitalism. This economy in our country is still raging, but the money isn't being properly distributed. That's the problem in this country. But that's a problem we can fix. If we vote correctly and we pressure Congress in the right way, we can fix that problem. But these other countries, they're not going to be able to fix their economies. No, that's my prediction. So watch it, see what happens. But
Well, you said you were interested in Varoufakis's book Techno-Feudalism. I'd be interested if you get a chance to read it, what you think. So yeah, he has a
Well, I
lot
think
to say. He has a lot to say on China and China's projects in the techno capitalist market, or what they call it, whatever you want. They're producing a lot of platforms, cloud, he calls it cloud capital, that are potentially going to outcompete us. And so that's the new, it's not about again, that's the breadth regime is outcompeting in a more open system. The depth regime is who can have the biggest piece of the feudal pie and then extract rents from everybody else. And so yeah, they're going to be distributing, sure, because they need people, they need serfs to some extent. But they're needing less and less of them. And I think there's a real danger of what happens when we get to that point when capitalism is becoming less and less of a thing, really. I mean, it's going to be more and more looking like, we're all living in a dystopian welfare state. And I think Slavoj Žižek had it right, that the future is socialism, one where either in the dystopian sense that the right wing is so afraid of, or in the utopian sense. It's probably not going to be, it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, right? But I think the game is like how dystopian is it going to be? And I think that does, I would disagree and say I don't think it's about which side of the political or cultural war wins, but about like how conscious people are of what's going on and how independent they can be. And so the more, and that's why there is some, I think, reason to vote Republican, although I don't think it often really matters. But there is at least an impulse on the right towards towards autonomy and independence from this cybernetic system, because the way things are going, especially on the left, but on both sides, but especially on the left, it's going to be more and more dependencies, and there's going to be less and less options outside this cybernetic network.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Yeah, because
we have no say, and so we just got to sit back and watch this.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to have a say, but my voice is a small voice.
Exactly. Yeah,
In
no
the
matter how persuasive we are, no one's listening at this point because, as you point out, the wealth that exists is too massive and too cut off from the larger mass. And
well, that's true. That's a problem. And the wealth is what has the biggest voice in what's going on.
exactly, that they're bribing our governments worldwide, and they're the ones calling the shots. So I agree with you that redistribution should happen, but the extent to which it's possible, I'm just not sure. I of course have not concluded that it's worth voting Republican, but I do understand what Adam's saying in a perverse way. Just misguided Republican identity ends up being right, sort of, because they're right to resist a completely administered cybernetic Leviathan. simply because they unreflectively unreflectively they just like freedom. It just
Pretty
happen
much.
to be right, clocks, broken clocks, right, once a day.
Right. Yeah, during the it's cycles according to this book, Capitalist Power. It's cycles between these two regimes usually, and like one side kind of tends to be right during one of those regimes. When power is all about breadth, and then it's like, whoa, well, we need more regulation. But then when the state comes in and the dominant capital starts coming in with lots of regulations for because that's what they want, then it's like freedom, freedom, freedom. So yeah, they use both sides for their own agendas, and we have to be able to use both sides, I think, for to fight for our freedom and for our welfare. So there's not the welfare state isn't inherently some awful thing. Like it's what we need. The community should be taken care of by the government in some sense. But if we all just become like cogs in its machine, that's not so good. Healthcare, I mean, universal healthcare, what a great idea. Well, now with COVID, we're seeing like what you basically have to like surrender your genetic material over to this machine, and you have to it's
Right.
so it's not simple. But I do think that there's something that we can do, and as I often say, I think there's an occult politics that's more important, and the whole optics of like language and myth and all that is just a surface level, but it is about the way people think and the way that they relate to each other and understand. That sets up the longer agenda of where we're going, because yeah, things are not going to obviously be perfect in our lifetime, so that once you surrender that, it's like, okay, obviously like these problems aren't going away anytime soon. And that's kind of maybe another thing that the left doesn't understand too much. They tend to think that the perfectibility of our systems is just around the corner, and when really there's very deep occult forces at work that are not going to be satisfied in any short time period. So better play the longer game, which is dealing with those forces, and that comes down to the politics of the everyday and the way that we treat each other and the institutions and ideas and communities that we form on our daily level.
Well, I think a lot of that is well said. Yeah, but I disagree with some of the strategy there. But
Fair enough.